3 years after my brother died, he walked into my office looking for a job. He sat down across from me, handed me a resume with the name Charlie Momsen on it, and asked about the benefits package. I stared at him, tears already springing to my eyes. My brother Tyson, who drowned in a lake 3 years ago, there in the flesh. We'd had a funeral. I'd given a eulogy, but here he was asking about vacation days and looking at me like I was a stranger. "Tyson?" I said, my voice barely working. He smiled politely and said, "Actually, it's Charlie. No big deal, though." He had a different haircut and a beard, but it was him. Same crooked nose from when he broke it playing basketball, same scar above his eyebrow. "Do you know who I am?" I asked. He studied my face carefully. "Should I? Have we worked together before?" There was no recognition in his eyes, nothing that showed he knew he was sitting across from his brother. I excused myself and ran to the bathroom where I threw up, then called my mom. "I need you to come to my office right now and don't ask questions," I said. While waiting, I Googled Charlie Momsen and found a LinkedIn profile created 2 years ago, work history going back 5 years, references, everything. But the photo was definitely Tyson. How did my brother have a complete fake identity that predated his death? My mom walked into the conference room where I'd asked Charlie to wait, took one look at him, and fainted. When she came to, she was sobbing and trying to touch his face while he backed away looking terrified. "I'm calling security," he said. "I don't know what's happening here, but you people are obviously confused." I showed him a photo on my phone of the 3 of us from 4 years ago. "This is you," I said. "You're Tyson Lavender. You're my brother." He stared at the photo for a long time, his hands starting to shake. "I don't remember this," he said quietly. "I don't remember anything before waking up in a hospital in Portland 4 years ago. They told me I'd been in an accident, that I had no identification, no family looking for me. But Tyson had disappeared from a lake in Colorado, not Portland. The search and rescue team had found his kayak and life jacket, but never his body. After 2 weeks, they'd declared him dead. "Someone told you that you had no family looking for you?" My mom asked through tears. "Who? What hospital?" Charlie pulled out his phone and showed us discharge papers from St. Mary's Medical Center in Portland. The attending physician was Dr. Rachel Wick. The discharge date was 1 week after Tyson's supposed drowning. "She said I'd been found on the side of a highway with severe head trauma," he said. "No wallet, no phone, nothing to identify me. She helped me get set up with a social worker who got me documents. I called St. Mary's Medical Center, but they said no doctor Rachel Wick had ever worked there. They had no record of any John Doe with head trauma from that time period. The discharge papers Charlie had were fake, but he'd been living with them as real documents for 3 years. "Then who treated me?" he asked, and I could see fear creeping into his eyes. "Who gave me this name? Who told me I had no family?" My mom remembered something. "The day before you disappeared, you called me and said you were worried about something at work. You said your boss was asking you to do something illegal with the accounts. You were going to report it to the SEC. Tyson had been an accountant at a tech startup that went public 6 months after he died. The founders were now worth hundreds of millions. Maybe I knew something," Charlie/Tyson said slowly. "Maybe someone wanted me gone." I looked up the company and the CEO, Wade St. John, who'd given a speech at Tyson's memorial service about losing a valued employee. But when I searched deeper, I found that 3 other employees from that time period had died in accidents or gone missing within a year of Tyson's disappearance. All of them had worked in accounting or legal. All of them would have known about any financial irregularities before the IPO. "We need to go to the police," my mom said, but Charlie shook his head. "I can't. The social worker who helped me, she checks in on me every few months. She always knows where I am, where I work. She says it's part of some program for people with traumatic brain injuries, but..." He pulled up her contact in his phone. The number had a Portland area code, but when I Googled it, it belonged to a shell company registered in Delaware. "Last week she called and said I should apply for this specific job at your company," Charlie said, and my blood went cold. "She said it would be perfect for my skill set. She even helped me prepare for the interview. Someone had deliberately sent my brother to my office, knowing I would recognize him, knowing it would trigger all of this. But why now, after 3 years? My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Stop digging, or he disappears again. This time, permanently." Attached was a photo of Charlie walking into our office building that morning, taken from across the street. In the background, barely visible, was someone in a baseball cap watching him. I zoomed in on the figure, and my mom gasped. It was Dr. Rachel Wick from the fake discharge papers, clearly visible and very much real. Charlie's phone rang and he answered on speaker. "Hello, Charlie," a woman's voice said. "I hear you've been having an interesting morning. Your brother needs to make a choice. Forget you exist again, or lose you forever." I ended the call and grabbed Charlie's arm, yanking him away from the window. Mom just stood there with her mouth open, not moving, not blinking. I pulled the blinds shut and looked at both of them. We needed to leave right now. Whoever took that photo knew where we were and what we were doing. I told Charlie to grab his things and Mom to follow us. My hands were shaking as I shoved my phone in my pocket and headed for the door. The hallway felt too long and too exposed as we walked to the elevator. Every person we passed could be watching us. I kept looking over my shoulder while we waited for the elevator doors to open. Inside, I hit the button for the parking garage 3 times, even though it was already lit up. I texted my boss from the elevator saying I had a family emergency and needed to leave immediately. He responded asking if everything was okay, but I didn't answer. The elevator doors opened to the parking garage, and I walked fast toward my car, still holding Charlie's arm. Mom was right behind us, her keys already in her hand. I told her to follow in her own car and to watch for anyone tailing her. She nodded, but looked scared in a way I'd never seen before. Charlie got in my passenger seat without saying anything. His face was pale, and his hands were still shaking from the phone call. I drove out of the garage, checking my mirrors every few seconds. A silver sedan pulled out 2 cars behind us, but turned off after a block. A black SUV followed for 3 lights before taking a different street. I couldn't tell if we were being followed or if I was just paranoid. Mom's car stayed behind me the whole way. I drove to a hotel across town, taking random turns and doubling back twice to make sure nobody was tracking us. The whole drive took 40 minutes, even though it should have been 15. Charlie sat quiet the entire time, staring out the window like he was trying to remember something. The hotel was one of those mid-range places that takes cash and doesn't ask too many questions. I parked in the back lot and waited for Mom to pull in next to me. Inside, I paid cash for 2 rooms right next to each other, giving a fake name to the clerk who barely looked up from his computer. He handed me 2 key cards and pointed toward the elevator. We rode up to the 3rd floor in silence. The rooms were basic, with beige walls and flowered bedspreads, but they had connecting doors between them. I unlocked both sides so we could move between the rooms easily. We sat in my room for a while, nobody talking, just processing what had happened. The threat had been clear and direct. Charlie kept looking at his phone like he expected it to ring again. Mom sat on the edge of the bed with her purse still on her shoulder. I could see Charlie starting to understand that people had been controlling every part of his life for 3 years. The social worker, the job applications, the monthly check-ins, all of it designed to keep track of him. He looked at me and asked why anyone would do this. I didn't have a good answer yet. I left the hotel and drove to a convenience store 3 blocks away. Inside, I bought 3 cheap burner phones with prepaid minutes, paying cash again. The clerk put them in a plastic bag without making eye contact. Back at the hotel, I opened all 3 phones and programmed our new numbers into each device. I told Mom and Charlie we'd only use these phones to contact each other from now on. Our regular phones stayed on, but we wouldn't discuss anything important on them. Charlie pulled out his fake discharge papers, and I took photos with my burner phone. I photographed his LinkedIn profile on my laptop and took screenshots of the threatening text message before it could disappear. Every piece of evidence got documented and backed up. Mom said we needed to call the police right now, that this was kidnapping and fraud and too big for us to handle alone. I understood her point, but something about the situation made me nervous. These people had resources and connections. Charlie spoke up and said his social worker seemed to know everyone in Portland's social services system. She'd mentioned working with police on other cases involving brain injury victims. She always knew where he was and what he was doing, sometimes before he even told her. If she had connections in law enforcement, going to the police might just tell them exactly where to find us. After Mom went to her room, I spent the night on my laptop researching the tech startup. Article after article came up about the successful IPO that made the founders rich overnight. The company had been valued at $20 million before going public. 6 months later, after Tyson disappeared, the IPO launched and the valuation jumped to $800 million. The timing matched up perfectly with when employees started disappearing. I found the CEO's name, Wade St. John, in dozens of articles calling him a visionary and a genius. He'd given a speech at Tyson's memorial service about losing a valued employee. I remembered him standing at the podium looking sad, and now I wanted to punch him. Around 2 a.m, I heard sounds coming from Charlie's room through the connecting door, thrashing and voices, like he was fighting someone in his sleep. I got up and went through to his room. He was sitting up in bed, sweating, his eyes open but not really seeing me. I turned on the lamp and he blinked a few times, coming back to the present. He said he'd been dreaming about being dragged somewhere. He could smell gasoline and hear water, like a lake or river. Someone was pulling him by his arms, and his head hurt so bad he couldn't think straight. The memory felt real, not like a normal dream. He described the smell of the gasoline mixing with the water smell and the sound of his own breathing echoing in an enclosed space. In the morning, I created a new email address using a fake name and no personal information. I found Michelle Haynes's contact information on her newspaper's website. She'd written a bunch of articles about corporate fraud and white-collar crime over the past few years. I wrote her a short message outlining the basic situation without using any real names yet. I said a person who was presumed dead had reappeared with complete fabricated identity documents, and there might be connections to corporate crime. I kept it vague for safety, but gave her enough details to understand this was serious. I hit send and waited. Michelle responded in less than 2 hours. Her email said she was interested and wanted to meet in person at a public coffee shop she named. She asked me to bring any documentation I had, but warned me to be careful about who I trusted. Her questions in the email made it clear she'd dealt with corporate cover-ups before. She wanted to know if anyone had threatened me and whether I'd contacted law enforcement yet. I wrote back saying we could meet that afternoon and gave her my burner phone number. She responded with a time and said to come alone if possible. The coffee shop was busy with the lunch crowd when I arrived. Michelle was already sitting at a corner table with her back to the wall. She looked like her photo on the newspaper website, maybe 40 years old with short dark hair and glasses. I sat down across from her, and she studied my face for a minute before saying anything. I pulled out Charlie's discharge papers, and she examined them carefully, holding them up to the light and running her finger along the signatures. After a few minutes, she said the formatting was wrong for St. Mary's Medical Center. The signature looked traced rather than naturally written, and the paper quality didn't match what hospitals typically use. This was professional forgery work, not something amateur. I showed Michelle the threatening text message and the photo of Charlie being watched, and she pulled out her phone to take pictures of everything. She asked if we'd made copies of all the documents, and I said yes. Everything was backed up on a thumb drive hidden in my car. She nodded and said that was smart, then asked if we'd noticed anyone following us to the coffee shop. I hadn't seen anyone, but now I felt exposed sitting there by the window where anyone could see us. Michelle said she had a detective friend who specialized in white-collar crime cases and might be willing to help us off the record. His name was Hugh Jackson, and he'd worked on corporate fraud investigations before, so he understood how dangerous these situations could get. She pulled up his contact and sent him a quick text explaining the basics, then waited for his response. Within 5 minutes, he wrote back saying he could meet us at his house that evening instead of anywhere public. Michelle said Hugh was careful about cases like this, because companies with money to hide usually had lawyers and private investigators watching for threats. We agreed to meet at 7 o'clock, and she gave us his address in a quiet neighborhood about 20 minutes away. Before we left the coffee shop, Michelle reminded us to vary our routes and check for anyone following, and to use cash instead of credit cards, so our movements couldn't be tracked. Back at the hotel, I told Mom and Charlie about Hugh, and they both looked relieved that someone with actual authority was willing to help. Charlie kept checking his phone like he expected the social worker to call any minute, and I could see his hands shaking every time the screen lit up. Hugh's house was a small ranch-style place with a neat lawn and a basketball hoop in the driveway. He answered the door in jeans and a college sweatshirt, looking more like a regular dad than a detective. He shook all our hands and led us to his dining room where he'd already cleared off the table. I spread out everything we had, the discharge papers, screenshots of the LinkedIn profile, photos of the threatening text, and the timeline of events we'd been building. Hugh sat down and started reading through each document carefully, making notes on a legal pad. He asked Charlie to walk him through everything he remembered from waking up in Portland, and Charlie described the hospital room and doctor, Wick, and the social worker who helped him get documents. Hugh wanted to know exact dates and times for everything, what the hospital room looked like, what doctor Wick was wearing, any details Charlie could remember. Then he turned to me and asked about Tyson's last days before he disappeared, what he'd been working on at the company, who he'd talked to about his concerns. I told him about the phone call to Mom, where Tyson said his boss was asking him to do something illegal with the accounts. Hugh wrote down the company name and Wade Street, John's name, then asked if Tyson had mentioned any specific numbers or transactions. Mom said he'd been worried about fake contracts that were being recorded as real sales, but he hadn't given her details because he wanted to gather all the evidence first. Hugh leaned back in his chair and was quiet for a minute, just thinking. He said, if this was what it looked like, we were dealing with people who had serious money and no problem getting rid of anyone who threatened them. The fact that 3 other employees had died or disappeared meant this wasn't just about covering up one person's knowledge. It was about protecting a massive fraud that made the founders hundreds of millions of dollars. He told us we needed to be extremely careful about who we talked to and where we went, because these people clearly had resources to track us and weren't afraid to use threats. Hugh said he could start making some quiet inquiries through his law enforcement contacts, checking hospital records and business registrations without tipping anyone off. But he warned us that official investigations took time and we needed to stay safe while he built a case. He suggested we keep moving between hotels and avoid any predictable patterns, use the burner phones for everything, and document every single thing that happened from now on. If someone followed us or contacted us or did anything suspicious, we needed to write it down with dates and times. Hugh said documentation was everything in cases like this because we'd need to prove a pattern of behavior. He asked if we'd be willing to eventually go public with the story, maybe through Michelle's newspaper, because that kind of exposure sometimes forced law enforcement to take action faster. Mom said she'd do whatever it took to keep Charlie safe and make sure the people who did this faced justice. Charlie just nodded, still looking scared, but also determined. The next morning, back at the hotel, I bought a whiteboard and markers from an office supply store. We set it up in Charlie's room and started mapping out everything we knew. I wrote Tyson's name at the top left, with the date he disappeared, then drew a line down to Charlie's name, with the date he woke up in the Portland hospital. That 1-week gap between the drowning and the hospital admission jumped out immediately, like a hole in the story that needed explaining. Mom added the names of the 3 other employees who died or disappeared, with their dates and how they'd supposedly died. 1 car accident, 1 hiking fall, 1 just vanished without a trace. All of them within 14 months of Tyson going missing. I wrote Wade Street, John's name in the center, and drew lines connecting him to the company, to the IPO, to all the dead employees. Then I added Dr. Wick's name and the social worker's name, connecting them to Charlie's fake identity and the shell company in Delaware. The board started looking like a conspiracy map, and that's exactly what it was. Charlie stood staring at it for a long time, his arms crossed over his chest. He pointed to the 1-week gap and asked what we thought happened during that time. I said they probably held him somewhere while they figured out what to do with him, maybe drugged him to keep him quiet, then transported him to Portland and created the whole fake story about finding him on a highway. Mom suggested they might have actually caused head trauma to make the memory loss more believable, and that thought made me sick. Charlie closed his eyes and I could see him trying to remember. He said something was coming back, not a clear memory, but more like a feeling. He remembered the smell of industrial cleaner, really strong like someone had just mopped a floor, and he remembered being in a vehicle, maybe a van, with the sound of highway traffic outside. There was a man's voice talking on a phone, saying something about Colorado plates being switched out. Charlie opened his eyes and said he remembered seeing a tattoo on someone's forearm when they brought him food, some kind of geometric shape, but he couldn't remember exactly what. I wrote all of this on the whiteboard under memory fragments and told him that was good, that more might come back as we kept working through this. Mom was crying again but trying to hide it, wiping her eyes with her sleeve. I went over and put my arm around her and she leaned against me. She said it was the first real proof that someone had actually taken Tyson, that he hadn't just drowned like we'd been told. All these years, she'd been grieving an accident, but now we knew it was murder, or at least kidnapping, and someone had deliberately destroyed our family. I held her while she cried, and Charlie just stood there looking at the whiteboard like it held answers he couldn't quite reach. My phone rang, and it was Michelle. She said she'd checked with her contacts in Portland and had some information. St. Mary's Medical Center had no record of any John Doe admissions during the week after Tyson disappeared, which we already knew, but now she had more details. The hospital's security logs showed after-hours access by a contractor called WPH Services on the same night Charlie remembered being there. Nobody at the hospital remembered authorizing that access, and there was no record of what work they supposedly did. Michelle said her contact found it strange because contractors usually had to sign in and show ID, but this entry just had a company name and a generic signature. She was going to dig deeper into WPH Services to see who owned it and what they actually did. I thanked her and told her about Charlie's memory of the van and the tattoo, and she said to write down every detail because those fragments might help identify who was involved. After we hung up, I opened my laptop and searched for WPH Services. The website came up looking completely generic, just a homepage saying they provided healthcare consulting and medical transport services. No staff photos, no client testimonials, no actual information about what they did. The business address was in Delaware, which I'd learned was where companies registered when they wanted to hide ownership. I tried calling the phone number listed and got a voicemail with a computer voice saying to leave a message. The whole thing felt fake, like a shell company set up just to look legitimate on paper. I searched for any news articles or reviews mentioning WPH Services and found nothing. It was like the company existed just enough to have a presence, but not enough to be real. I wrote down everything I found, which wasn't much, and sent the information to Hugh. He texted back saying he'd run the business registration through law enforcement databases and see what came up. An hour later, he called and said WPH Services was registered in Delaware as a healthcare consulting company, but the listed owner was another shell company in the Cayman Islands. He'd found that WPH had contracts with several private rehabilitation facilities and medical transport companies, all of which seemed legitimate on the surface. But the ownership chain went through so many layers of shell companies that it was almost impossible to trace who actually controlled it. Hugh said this was typical for companies involved in illegal activities. They built complicated corporate structures specifically to hide the real owners. He asked if we'd heard of the Cayman Islands Shell Company before, and I said no, but now we had another piece of the puzzle to investigate. That same evening, Charlie's phone rang with his Portland number, and he stared at it for 3 rings before answering on speaker. The social worker's voice came through sounding friendly, but with an edge underneath that made my skin crawl, asking why he'd missed his monthly check-in appointment scheduled for yesterday afternoon. She said she needed to update her records for insurance purposes, and it was very important that she knew his current location and employment status. Charlie glanced at me, and I held up my hand in a stop gesture, shaking my head while he fumbled for words. He told her he was staying with friends while job hunting and things had been busy with interviews, trying to sound casual, but his voice shook slightly. The line went quiet for just a beat too long before she accepted this explanation, saying she'd reschedule for next week and asking which part of the city he was staying in. Charlie said he wasn't sure of the exact neighborhood and would call her back with details, then ended the call with his hands trembling. Mom looked between us and said that didn't feel like a normal check-in. It felt like someone tracking his movements and making sure he stayed where they could find him. I agreed completely because the questions were too specific, and her pause after his vague answer felt like she was deciding whether to push harder or back off. We spent the rest of the evening watching the door and keeping the curtains closed, nobody sleeping much while we took turns monitoring the parking lot through a gap in the blinds. At 3 in the morning, I woke to the sound of our door handle turning slowly and sat up instantly with my heart pounding. The handle moved down smoothly, like someone was testing whether it was locked, not rattling it or trying to force entry, just checking if we'd made a mistake. I held my breath, watching the metal lever press down fully before releasing, then heard footsteps moving away down the hallway in the direction of the stairwell rather than the elevator. I didn't move for 5 full minutes, listening to every creak and distant sound before crossing to Mom and Charlie's adjoining room to wake them. Charlie was already awake, sitting on the edge of his bed, and said he'd heard it too, and Mom grabbed her phone asking if we should call the police. I said no, because by the time they arrived, whoever it was would be long gone, and besides, we didn't know who we could trust when these people seemed to have connections everywhere. We packed our bags in silence and sat fully dressed until the sky started turning gray outside. We checked out at dawn before the front desk staff changed shifts, using cash again and giving a fake name this time instead of my real one. The clerk didn't even look up from her computer screen as we left our keycards on the counter and walked out to the parking garage. Charlie was quiet in the car as we drove across the city to a different hotel on the east side, finally saying he was scared that the people who controlled his life for 3 years wouldn't just let him walk away. He said they'd spent too much time and money creating his fake identity to lose track of him now, and whatever they were hiding must be serious enough that they'd rather kill him than let him remember. Mom reached back from the front seat and squeezed his hand, telling him we wouldn't let that happen, but I could see the fear in her eyes too, because we were running from people who'd already proven they could make someone disappear completely. The new hotel was smaller and cheaper, the kind of place that didn't ask questions about cash payments or require ID verification, and we got 2 rooms on the 2nd floor near the back exit. Michelle called that afternoon and said she'd arranged for us to meet with Gabe Atkinson, one of Tyson's former colleagues who'd left the company 6 months after the IPO. She said Gabe had been nervous about talking, but agreed to meet at Riverside Park instead of anywhere enclosed because he didn't feel safe in buildings anymore. We drove to the park at 4 and found Gabe sitting on a bench near the playground, wearing sunglasses and a baseball cap pulled low even though it wasn't sunny. He kept looking around while we approached, scanning the parking lot and the paths like he expected someone to jump out at any moment. I sat down next to him and introduced myself as Tyson's brother, watching his face go pale under the cap brim. He asked if Tyson was really alive, and I said yes, but with no memory of his previous life, and Gabe closed his eyes, like this confirmed something he'd been afraid of for 3 years. Gabe started talking fast and quiet, saying Tyson had discovered the company was lying about revenue numbers before the IPO. The CFO had been creating fake vendors and booking contracts that didn't exist to make the company look profitable when it was actually losing money every quarter. Tyson found the evidence in the accounting records because the shell vendors all had similar registration patterns and payment schedules that didn't match real business transactions. The fake sales totaled over $15 million, enough to push the company from borderline bankruptcy to looking like a successful growth business that investors would want to buy into. Gabe said Tyson had been excited about reporting it because he thought he was doing the right thing, protecting investors from fraud, not realizing that people with hundreds of millions on the line would do anything to shut him up. According to Gabe, Tyson had compiled a folder with all the documentation, including spreadsheets showing the fake transactions, emails from the CFO about the shell vendors, and bank records proving the money was just moving in circles between company accounts. He was planning to take everything to the SEC the week after his kayaking trip, had even scheduled a meeting with an enforcement officer for the Monday after he disappeared. The folder vanished from Tyson's desk after he was declared dead, and Gabe had been too scared to say anything because other people who knew about the fraud started having accidents. An accountant named Lisa O'Neill died in a car crash 2 months later. A lawyer named Janice Webb went missing during a business trip to Austin, and another accountant named James Park fell off his apartment balcony after drinking too much. Gabe said he quit 6 months after the IPO because he couldn't sleep anymore, knowing what had happened and being too afraid to tell anyone. I asked Gabe if he remembered the names of any shell vendors, and he pulled out his phone, scrolling through old photos until he found a picture he'd secretly taken of one of Tyson's spreadsheets. He zoomed in and pointed to a vendor name at the top of the list, WPH Services, the same company that had accessed the Portland hospital after hours, the same company registered to an offshore shell in the Cayman Islands, now directly connected to the accounting fraud Tyson was going to report. My stomach dropped as the pieces clicked together because this proved the conspiracy wasn't just about covering up corporate fraud. It was about eliminating anyone who threatened to expose it before the IPO made the founders rich. Gabe said there were 2 other shell vendors on the list, but WPH Services had the most fake contracts, over $8 million in recorded sales that never actually happened. I called Hugh from the park, and he arrived 20 minutes later, parking his personal car instead of anything official. Gabe went through everything again, while Hugh took notes, and when he finished, Hugh said we now had enough to justify an official investigation, but we needed to be extremely careful about how we proceeded. He said if we moved too fast, the people behind this would destroy evidence and disappear, but if we moved too slow, they might eliminate us, like they did the other witnesses. Hugh wanted to bring in federal investigators, because this was securities fraud on top of kidnapping and murder, but he needed us to stay safe and hidden while he built the case properly. Gabe agreed to give an official statement, but only if Hugh could guarantee protection, and Hugh said he'd work on getting him into witness security through the FBI. I spent the next morning on the phone with my boss, explaining I had a family health crisis and needed to work remotely for a few weeks. He sounded annoyed and said this was really bad timing with the quarterly reports due, but I pushed back and said it was unavoidable, and I'd keep up with my work from wherever I was staying. He agreed reluctantly, and I could tell my career was taking a hit from the vague explanations and sudden absence. But right now, keeping my family alive mattered more than keeping my job secure. I set up my laptop in the hotel room and started working through emails, while Mom and Charlie watched the news, waiting to hear if anything had leaked about the investigation yet. Michelle called 2 hours later and said her Portland contact had tracked down the security guard who worked the night shift when Charlie was brought to the hospital. The guard agreed to meet with her privately because he remembered something weird about that night, something that had bothered him for years, but he never knew who to tell. I put her on speaker so Mom and Charlie could hear while she explained the guard's story. He remembered a private ambulance showing up around 2 in the morning with a patient who seemed really out of it, like heavily drugged or sedated. A woman with dark hair signed all the paperwork using the name Dr. Rachel Wick, and she acted completely professional and confident like she belonged there. The guard said she had a medical bag with her and wore scrubs with what looked like a real hospital ID badge clipped to her shirt. She stayed with the patient for about 3 hours in one of the private rooms on the 2nd floor, and when the private ambulance came back, she specifically told the guard not to log the visit in the official records. She said it was some kind of special medical transport situation that needed to stay confidential for patient privacy reasons, and the guard believed her because everything seemed legitimate. Michelle asked if he could describe the woman in more detail, and he said she was maybe 40 years old, average height, dark hair pulled back in a ponytail, and she moved like someone who knew exactly what she was doing. When Michelle showed him the surveillance photo we had of Dr. Wick, he confirmed immediately that was the same woman. Charlie went pale listening to this, because it meant someone had planned every detail of erasing his identity, right down to bribing or tricking hospital staff into not keeping records. Hugh called me directly after Michelle shared the guard's information and said he was going to get a warrant to check Dr. Rachel Wick's credentials with the state medical board. He wanted official documentation of the identity theft before we moved forward with anything else. The warrant came through the next morning, and Hugh's contact at the medical board ran a full search on Rachel Wick. They found a licensed physician with that exact name, but she worked in dermatology in Seattle and had never been to Portland in her entire career. When Hugh showed us the real Dr. Wick's photo from her medical license, she looked nothing like the woman in our surveillance image. The real Rachel Wick was blonde, shorter, and about 10 years younger than the woman who had signed Charlie into the hospital. Someone had stolen a real doctor's name and credentials to create a completely fake identity, which meant they had access to medical databases and the know-how to forge official documents that could fool hospital security. Hugh said this level of planning showed we were dealing with professionals who did this kind of work regularly, not some amateur cover-up. The sophistication scared me because it meant these people had resources and connections way beyond what a normal company would have. We were sitting in the hotel room processing all this new information when Charlie suddenly grabbed his head and said he smelled something. Mom asked what he meant, and he said, "Hospital disinfectant, that sharp chemical smell that hospitals use everywhere." His hands started shaking, and he closed his eyes, describing a memory fragment that was coming back to him. He remembered being in a white van with no windows in the back, lying on some kind of padded bench or stretcher. He could hear a man's voice talking on a phone or radio, saying something about Colorado plates being off and that he was clean now. Charlie opened his eyes and looked at me with this expression of pure fear because he realized they had transported him all the way from Colorado to Portland, specifically to hide his identity where nobody would think to look for him. The deliberate planning of it made my stomach hurt, because every new detail showed how calculated this whole thing was. Hugh said the white van detail was important because it meant they used a specific vehicle for the transport, something that could be traced if we could find it. Michelle suggested we stake out the address listed for WPH services to see if we could spot Dr. Wick or anyone else connected to the operation. She had a photographer friend who owed her a favor and could get long-range shots without being obvious. We drove to the address the next afternoon and parked down the street where we had a clear view of the building entrance. The photographer set up in a different car with professional equipment that could zoom in from a distance. We sat there for 3 hours drinking bad coffee and watching people come and go before we finally saw her. Dr. Wick walked out of the building around 5 in the evening and met with a man in an expensive suit on the sidewalk. They talked for maybe 10 minutes while the photographer clicked away, getting clear shots of both of them. The man handed her something that looked like an envelope, and they shook hands before walking to separate cars. I wrote down the license plate number of the man's car and texted it to Hugh immediately. He ran it through his contacts at the DMV and called me back within an hour. The license plate came back registered to a venture capital firm called Cascade Partners that had been one of the original investors in Wade Street, John's tech startup. This directly connected the fake doctor, the shell company WPH Services, and the people who had the most to lose if Tyson exposed the fraud before the IPO made them all rich. Every piece of evidence was linking together into one massive conspiracy that went way higher than just Wade and his CFO. Mom's phone rang that evening while we were still processing the venture capital connection. She answered and put it on speaker because we'd agreed to share all calls. A man's voice said he was calling from her bank's fraud department and needed to verify some recent transactions on her account. He asked detailed questions about her travel over the past few weeks and recent purchases, claiming there was suspicious activity they needed to confirm. Mom started answering before I grabbed the phone and hung up, then immediately called her bank's customer service number from their website. The real bank representative said they had no record of making any fraud calls to her number and no suspicious activity on her account. Hugh confirmed the next morning that it was a phishing attempt designed to gather information about our movements and financial situation. We realized they weren't just watching us physically, but also trying to track us through digital means, monitoring our credit cards and phone records to figure out where we were and what we were doing. Hugh told us to set up new email accounts that nobody knew about and to stop using our regular credit cards for anything related to the investigation. We spent the afternoon creating new accounts and transferring important documents to encrypted cloud storage. Michelle called with one more piece of information that gave us hope. Her newspaper's lawyer had reviewed everything we'd gathered and explained the legal protections available for whistleblowers who report securities fraud to the SEC. If we could get Tyson's original evidence or recreate it with Gabe's help, we could file a formal complaint that would trigger a federal investigation. The lawyer said once we filed with the SEC, we'd have protection from retaliation, and the government would have to take the case seriously. Michelle asked if Gabe would be willing to meet again and provide more detailed information about the fake contracts and shell vendors, and I said I'd reach out to him. The lawyer also mentioned that if we could prove the company knew about the fraud and actively covered it up by eliminating witnesses, we'd have grounds for a massive civil lawsuit on top of the criminal charges. Mom looked at Charlie and said, We were going to make sure everyone involved paid for what they did to him, and for the first time since this whole thing started, I felt like we actually had a path forward, instead of just running scared. I reached out to Gabe the next day using one of the burner phones and asked if he'd be willing to meet again. He hesitated for a long moment before saying yes, but insisted we meet somewhere even more public than last time, so we agreed on a busy shopping mall food court during lunch hour. When we sat down across from him 2 days later, he had a manila folder that looked worn and creased, like he'd been carrying it around for years. He slid it across the table, and I opened it to find printed copies of emails, dozens of them, all with the company logo at the top. The emails showed the CFO explicitly telling accounting staff to book revenue from something called WPH Services and 2 other companies I didn't recognize, with amounts that made my hands shake as I read them. $15 million in total, spread across fake contracts that never existed, all designed to make the company look profitable before the IPO. Gabe pointed to one email where the CFO wrote that these vendors were approved by the board and not to ask questions about the services provided. Charlie stared at the pages, and I could see him processing that these were the exact kind of records Tyson must have found 3 years ago. We thanked Gabe and he left quickly, looking over his shoulder the whole way to the parking lot. That afternoon, we met Hugh at his house again and spread the emails across his kitchen table. He read through each one carefully, taking photos with his phone and making notes about dates and amounts. Hugh explained that this was enough to file a formal complaint with the SEC, and with the connection to Dr. Wick and the shell company, we had a solid case for fraud and witness tampering. He helped us write up an anonymous tip that included everything we'd gathered over the past few weeks. We attached scans of the emails, the fake discharge papers, the shell company registration, and a detailed timeline of the employee deaths and disappearances. Hugh submitted it through the SEC's online portal using an encrypted connection, and we requested protection as material witnesses given the threats we'd been receiving. The confirmation email came back within an hour saying the tip had been received and assigned a case number. For the first time since this started, I felt like we'd actually done something that couldn't be undone or covered up. 2 days passed in tense silence while we waited in the hotel room, barely leaving except for food. Charlie kept his regular phone on and charged, waiting to see if anyone would react to our SEC filing. On the 3rd morning, his phone rang with a number he didn't recognize. He looked at me and Mom before answering on speaker, setting the phone on the table between us. The woman's voice was calm and professional, almost friendly. She said her name was Rachel, and she understood we'd been having some difficulties lately. She knew where we were staying and what we'd been doing, and she wanted to offer us a way out of this situation. $200,000 in cash, split however we wanted, if we agreed to forget everything and disappear permanently. Charlie would keep his identity as Charlie. We'd never contact the SEC again, and everyone could move on with their lives. The alternative, she said in that same pleasant tone, would be consequences that would make the last 3 years look merciful. I grabbed my phone and started recording while signaling Charlie to keep her talking. He asked what she meant by consequences, and she laughed, actually laughed, before explaining that relocating Tyson after he became a liability had been expensive and complicated. She said doing it again would be much simpler now that they knew what worked, and this time they wouldn't bother with the fake identity and social worker check-ins. Charlie's voice shook as he asked what she meant by relocating, and she paused like she realized she'd said too much. The line went dead, and we sat there staring at the phone for a full minute. I played back the recording, and we listened to her admission that they'd relocated Tyson, that he'd been a liability, that the whole Charlie identity had been their creation. Hugh came over within the hour after I called him and listened to the recording 3 times. He said it might not be allowed in court, depending on state laws about recording phone calls, but it was valuable evidence of ongoing criminal activity. The recording proved they were still actively threatening us and admitted to kidnapping Tyson rather than helping an injured stranger. Hugh told us to act like we were thinking about the offer while actually preparing to go completely public with everything we had. He explained that once the story was out in the open, they couldn't make us disappear quietly because too many people would know what happened. We spent the rest of that day coordinating with Michelle about timing. She'd been working on her article for the past week, carefully writing it to protect our identities while laying out all the evidence. Hugh said he could launch an official investigation the same day the article published, and we could give our formal witness statements to federal prosecutors at the same time. The plan was to make everything public at once, so they couldn't pick us off one by one, or intimidate us into silence like they'd done to Tyson and the other employees. Michelle scheduled the article to go live at 6 in the morning, which would give it the whole news cycle to spread before the company could organize a response. The night before publication, Mom went to the grocery store to pick up some basic supplies since we'd been eating takeout for days. She called me from her car 40 minutes later, her voice tight with fear, saying a dark sedan had been following her for the past 10 minutes. I told her to drive straight to the nearest police station, and she did, watching in her mirror as the car turned away as soon as she pulled into the station parking lot. She sat there for 20 minutes making sure they were really gone before driving to the hotel, taking a complicated route to make sure nobody followed. When she walked into our room, she wasn't crying or shaking like I expected. She was angry, actually furious, pacing back and forth and saying she was done being scared of these people. She said they'd stolen 3 years of her son's life, put our family through hell, and now they were following her around town like some kind of movie villain. Mom sat down on the bed and looked at both of us and said she wanted these people to face real justice, not just get away with everything because we were too frightened to fight back. Charlie had been quiet most of the evening, but he finally spoke up and admitted he was scared about what would happen once we went public. He said he'd spent 3 years thinking he was Charlie, believing the story they'd told him about being found on a highway with no family. Now he was about to blow up that entire fake life, and he didn't know what came next. But he also said, and his voice got stronger as he talked, that he was tired of other people controlling his life and telling him who he was. Even if he never remembered being Tyson, even if those memories were gone forever, he wanted to know the truth about what happened to him and why someone thought they had the right to erase him. He wanted to take control back for the first time since waking up in that Portland hospital. I set an alarm for 5:30 in the morning and barely slept, checking my phone every hour to see if Michelle had sent any updates. At exactly 6 o'clock, her text came through with a link to the article. The headline read, "Tech IPO Success Built on Fraud and Disappeared Witnesses," and the first paragraph laid out the basic facts about fake revenue, shell companies, and employees who'd vanished or died under suspicious circumstances. Michelle had done an incredible job writing it carefully enough to avoid libel while making the evidence clear and compelling. She didn't name us directly, but referred to a former employee who'd discovered the fraud and subsequently disappeared, and family members who'd recently uncovered evidence of kidnapping and identity theft. By 7 o'clock, 3 national news outlets had picked up the story. By 8, the company's stock was already dropping, and their PR team had issued a statement saying they were reviewing the allegations. By 9, we were sitting in Hugh's office giving formal statements to federal prosecutors who'd driven up from the regional office as soon as they saw the article. The prosecutors spent 3 hours taking our statements, asking detailed questions about every interaction with Charlie's social worker and every piece of evidence we'd collected. They recorded everything and had us sign official witness declarations, explaining that federal charges were likely given the interstate nature of the crimes. Hugh left the room around 10 in the morning to coordinate the search warrant executions, and we could hear him on the phone in the hallway giving instructions to teams in Portland and here in Colorado. By 11, he came back in and told us the warrants were being served right now at WPH Services office and Dr. Wick's home address. We sat in tense silence waiting for updates, Mom holding Charlie's hand while he stared at the conference room table looking scared but determined. Hugh's phone started buzzing constantly around noon with photos and updates from the search teams. They'd found boxes of forged medical documents at the WPH Services office, blank hospital discharge forms, fake ID materials, and most importantly, financial records showing wire transfers from the venture capital firm. The payments totaled over $3 million spread across 4 years, all coded as consulting fees, but with notes in the margins referencing specific names and dates. One of the prosecutors looked at the photos on Hugh's phone and immediately called his supervisor, saying they had enough for multiple federal charges. At Dr. Wick's house, officers found a locked filing cabinet in her basement containing what she called patient logs. The logs had 4 names written in careful handwriting with dates, locations, and status updates. Tyson Lavender was listed 3rd with notes about the Colorado Lake incident, Portland hospital placement, and ongoing monitoring through the social worker. The other 3 names matched the missing employees from the tech company, and next to 2 of them were the words permanent resolution, with dates that corresponded to when their deaths had been reported. Mom started crying when Hugh showed us the photo of Tyson's entry, and Charlie looked like he might throw up seeing his real name written in this woman's private records. The prosecutors immediately issued an arrest warrant for Dr. Wick, and by 2 in the afternoon, Hugh called to say she'd been taken into custody at her home without incident. She was charged with kidnapping, identity fraud, conspiracy, and witness tampering, and her lawyer showed up within an hour demanding bail. The bail hearing happened fast because Dr. Wick was considered a flight risk given her resources and the severity of the charges. The judge denied bail after prosecutors presented the patient log and financial records, saying she posed a danger to witnesses and had demonstrated willingness to help people disappear. Meanwhile, news of the search warrants had leaked to the media, and by 3 in the afternoon, the tech company's stock was dropping fast. The CFO resigned within hours, releasing a statement through his lawyer claiming he had no knowledge of any illegal activities and had been deceived by outside consultants. The stock price dropped 30% in a single trading day as investors panicked about potential fraud charges and the connection to missing employees. Charlie watched the stock ticker on his phone with a strange expression, realizing that his disappearance had been worth hundreds of millions of dollars to the people who'd erased him. Wade Street John called an emergency press conference at 4 in the afternoon, standing in front of the company logo with his lawyer visible just off camera. He denied any involvement in wrongdoing and claimed he'd been deceived by his CFO and outside consultants who he'd trusted to handle sensitive matters. He announced an internal investigation and promised full cooperation with authorities, but every word sounded rehearsed, and his lawyer kept leaning in to whisper corrections when reporters asked specific questions. Mom watched the press conference on her phone and said she remembered Wade giving that same smooth performance at Tyson's memorial service, talking about what a valued employee he'd been, while knowing the whole time what had really happened. The SEC issued a formal announcement that evening about launching an investigation into the company's pre-IPO accounting practices. Hugh called us around 6 and explained this meant federal prosecutors were now fully involved and the case had moved beyond local law enforcement into a major white-collar crime investigation with resources and reach we couldn't have accessed on our own. He also warned us that we should expect retaliation attempts because people with this much money and this much to lose don't give up easily. The threatening messages started coming to our burner phones around 7 that evening, texts from unknown numbers saying things like, "You made a mistake, and this isn't over." Hugh said this actually helped the case because it demonstrated ongoing witness intimidation, which added more charges and showed a pattern of criminal behavior. He arranged for protective surveillance on all of us, with officers watching our hotel and following us when we went anywhere, and he told us to document every single contact attempt, no matter how minor it seemed. Michelle called around 8 with news that a nurse from Portland had reached out after reading her article. The nurse's name was Rosie Hood, and she said she remembered the John Doe patient from 3 years ago and Dr. Wick's strange after-hours visits to his room. Rosie said she'd kept personal notes because something about the whole situation had felt wrong, and she was willing to testify about what she'd witnessed. Michelle arranged for us to meet Rosie the next day at Hugh's office, where she could give an official statement. When Rosie arrived, she brought a folder of shift notes she'd kept in her personal files at home. The notes showed a patient matching Charlie's description had been brought in with head trauma and kept heavily sedated for 3 days before being transferred by private ambulance. Rosie had written down Dr. Wick's specific instructions to the nursing staff not to contact police about the unidentified patient, and she'd noted that Dr. Wick had access to the patient's room at all hours, despite not being on the hospital staff. The prosecutors reviewed Rosie's notes and said combined with the documents seized from Dr. Wick's home, they had enough evidence to charge her with multiple felonies. Dr. Wick's lawyer started negotiating a potential plea deal almost immediately, trying to exchange information about who hired her for reduced charges. She was denied bail again at a second hearing because the judge said the evidence showed she was part of an ongoing criminal enterprise. The venture capital firm issued a statement that afternoon, claiming the payments to WPH Services were for legitimate medical consulting work related to employee wellness programs. But Michelle had been digging deeper and found that the firm's managing partner was Wade Saint, John's college roommate from business school, and he'd been on the company's board of directors during the IPO. She published a follow-up article connecting all the dots between the venture capital firm, Wade, the fake medical consulting company, and the systematic elimination of employees who knew about the accounting fraud. Hugh connected us with a therapist who worked with trauma victims and people who'd had their memories messed with. Charlie started going twice a week to Dr. Sarah O'Neill's office downtown, and she explained that his amnesia was probably a mix of the head injury and his brain protecting itself from what happened to him. The human mind does weird things when someone tries to erase who you are, she said. It builds walls to keep you safe, even if those walls trap you away from everyone you knew. Mom and I sat in the waiting room during his 3rd session, drinking bad coffee from the machine and not talking much. We could hear Charlie's voice through the door sometimes, low and careful, like he was trying to remember something just out of reach. 40 minutes into the session, we heard him shout, not scared exactly, but surprised and angry at the same time. Dr. O'Neill opened the door a minute later and asked us to come in. Charlie was sitting forward in his chair with his hands pressed against his face, breathing hard. He looked up when we came in, and his eyes were wet. He told us he remembered being in a basement room with concrete walls and a single light bulb hanging from the ceiling. There was a metal bed frame with a thin mattress and a bucket in the corner. A man brought him food twice a day, and the man had a geometric tattoo on his forearm, like interlocking triangles or something. The man told Charlie his family didn't want him anymore, said he'd been in a car accident and suffered brain damage, and his parents had signed papers giving up custody because they couldn't handle taking care of someone so broken. Charlie remembered believing it because he couldn't remember anything else, and the man seemed so sure, so matter-of-fact about it. The man said Charlie was lucky they were helping him start over instead of leaving him in some state facility. Mom started crying before Charlie finished talking. Not the relieved crying from when we first found him, but this horrible, broken sobbing that made my chest hurt. She kept saying they tortured him. They broke him on purpose. They made him think we abandoned him while we were burying an empty coffin. I put my arm around her, but she was shaking so hard I didn't know if it helped. The cruelty of it hit me different from the kidnapping itself. They didn't just take my brother. They made him believe he was alone in the world, that nobody cared if he lived or died, that he was damaged goods his own family had thrown away. They did that while we were crying ourselves sick and putting up missing person posters and calling the police every day for updates. Dr. O'Neill said this kind of psychological manipulation was designed to make victims compliant and dependent. If Charlie believed he had nowhere else to go, he wouldn't try to escape or contact anyone from his old life. She said recovering these memories was progress, but it would be painful, and we needed to be patient with the process. I called Hugh from the parking lot and described the geometric tattoo. He said he'd run it through databases of known security contractors and private investigators. 2 days later, he called back with a name. Samuel Greer, former Army, worked for corporate investigation firms doing surveillance and witness management. Hugh had a photo, and when we showed it to Charlie, he went pale and had to sit down. That was the man from the basement, the man who'd fed him lies along with his meals. Hugh said Samuel had disappeared after the search warrants were executed at Dr. Wick's house and the Shell Company office. His apartment was cleared out, and his truck was gone. The FBI issued a federal warrant for his arrest on kidnapping charges and put him on their wanted list. Meanwhile, the tech company's board of directors held an emergency meeting that leaked to the press within hours. They voted to remove Wade as CEO while the investigations continued. The official statement said they were taking action to protect shareholders and restore confidence, but everyone knew it was about limiting liability. Wade hadn't been charged with anything yet, but the board was running scared. His lawyer held a press conference where Wade stood there in an expensive suit looking concerned and claimed he'd been betrayed by his CFO and had no knowledge of any criminal activity. It was the same script every CEO used when their company got caught doing something awful. Dr. Wick's lawyer came to the prosecutors 3 weeks after her arrest with a deal on the table. She'd provide detailed testimony about who hired her and what instructions she received in exchange for reduced charges. The prosecutors agreed to consider it, and she started talking. She named the CFO as her main contact, said he'd paid her through the Shell Company to handle problem employees who knew too much about the accounting fraud. She also said Wade knew about the program, called it problem employee management in meetings, acted like it was a normal business function to make inconvenient people disappear. Based on Dr. Wick's testimony and the documents they'd seized, federal prosecutors filed charges against the CFO on conspiracy to commit kidnapping, securities fraud, witness tampering, the whole list. They also charged Samuel Greer, even though he was still missing, issuing a federal warrant that made him a fugitive from justice. The news coverage was constant. Michelle's newspaper ran follow-up articles almost daily as new details emerged. Other reporters picked up the story and started digging into the venture capital firm and Wade's business school connections. The company's stock price kept dropping. Our lawyer filed a civil lawsuit against the company, Wade personally, and the venture capital firm for damages related to Tyson's kidnapping and everything our family had been through. The company's lawyers called within days trying to negotiate a settlement. They wanted this to go away quietly, wanted to write a check and make us sign non-disclosure agreements. We told them no. Not until the criminal cases were resolved and everyone responsible was in prison. 3 months after Charlie walked into my office, we went to court for a hearing about his legal identity. The prosecutor had filed paperwork to officially restore his status as Tyson Lavender, and the judge reviewed all the evidence we'd gathered. Medical records, DNA tests, testimony from people who'd known Tyson before he disappeared. The judge was an older guy with white hair and reading glasses, and he looked genuinely angry as he read through the case file. He called it one of the most disturbing examples of corporate wrongdoing he'd seen in 30 years on the bench. He signed the order right there, declaring that Charlie Momsen was a fabricated identity and that the man in front of him was legally and officially Tyson Lavender. Tyson cried during the hearing. So did Mom and I. It felt like getting a piece of him back, even though he still didn't remember being our brother. Samuel Greer got arrested 2 weeks later trying to cross into Mexico at a border checkpoint in Texas. The Border Patrol agent ran his license and saw the federal warrant, and Samuel tried to run, but they caught him in the parking lot. They extradited him back to face charges, and suddenly prosecutors had all the main players in custody, except Wade. Samuel's lawyer tried to negotiate his own deal, but the prosecutors weren't interested. They had Dr. Wick's testimony, and enough evidence to put Samuel away for decades. Hughes said this closed the last major gap in the case. They had the doctor who faked the medical records, the muscle who'd actually kidnapped and held Tyson, and the CFO who'd orchestrated everything. Wade was still claiming ignorance, still hiding behind lawyers and public relations firms, but the walls were closing in on him too. The civil lawsuit settled 6 months after we filed it, with the company agreeing to pay $8 million and publicly admit their role in making Tyson disappear. The settlement papers included specific provisions for Tyson's ongoing medical care and therapy sessions, plus the company had to create whistleblower protection programs, so this could never happen to another employee who tried to report fraud. Their lawyers tried multiple times to get us to take less money and sign agreements saying we couldn't talk about what happened, but we refused every offer until they met our terms completely. The judge who approved the settlement said it was one of the largest awards he'd seen for corporate wrongdoing of this type, and he made sure the public acknowledgement was detailed enough that everyone would know exactly what the company had done to cover up their financial crimes. Tyson moved into an apartment 3 blocks from Mom's house and 5 blocks from mine, close enough that we can walk over whenever we want, but far enough that he has his own space to figure out who he is now. He goes to therapy twice a week, and the therapist says small memory fragments keep surfacing, mostly triggered by smells or sounds rather than anything visual. Last month, he remembered the exact way Mom used to make pancakes on Saturday mornings, and he showed up at her house asking if she still made them that way, which made her cry for an hour. He may never fully remember being my brother 3 years ago, or the life he had before they took him, but we're building new memories together now, going to basketball games and having dinners and teaching him about the family he forgot. The people who tried to erase him are sitting in prison cells waiting for their trials, and Wade just agreed to a plea deal that will put him away for 15 years. It's not the same as getting those 3 years back, but it's something, and Tyson says that's enough for him to move forward with his life.